There was a sound in the dead of night that could end the world. Not a bomb's roar, not a siren's wail, softer than that, quieter, almost tender. A wire humming, thin as a spider's thread, stretching from Moscow to the Virginia hills, carrying secrets that could unravel empires with nothing more than a whisper. And in 1952, deep beneath those autumn crisp hills where the leaves rustled like pages torn from a forbidden book, someone was listening. His name was Elias Thorne, not a general, not a politician. Just a man with headphones pressed to his ears and trembling fingers hovering over a reel-to-reel tape recorder, alone in a concrete bunker that smelled of rain-soaked earth and the electric tang of overworked vacuum tubes. The kind of man history forgets until someone digs deep enough to find his fingerprints on the fate of nations. Outside, the metallic scent of October rain mixed with ozone, and the wind, God, the wind, howled through ventilation shafts like voices calling from the other side of the iron curtain. Inside, silence, then static, then something else. A single intercepted transmission from Moscow, crackling through the ether like a ghost learning to speak again. The sound swelled, ambient static punctuated by Morse code beeps that mimicked a heartbeat. Dit-dit-da, dit-dit-da, quickening. Elias leaned closer, his breath fogging the green glow of cathode ray tubes that cast his shadow large and trembling against concrete walls veined with moisture. The walls seemed to breathe. Or maybe that was just him, chest tight, knowing what he held in his hands could shatter lives, governments, the fragile peace that wasn't really peace at all but a cold, endless standoff. This was the Venona Project, though no one called it that yet. Not really. It was just the work, the secret, soul-grinding labor of cryptanalysts hidden in Virginia facilities that officially didn't exist, decrypting Soviet cables that officially weren't being sent. Arlington Hall, a former girls' school, turned into America's nerve center for breaking unbreakable codes. Funny, isn't it? How the fate of the free world rested in the hands of mathematicians and linguists working under fluorescent lights that hummed like prayers, chain-smoking through sleepless nights while the rest of the country slept soundly, never knowing. They'd already found the Rosenbergs through these wires. Julius and Ethel, atomic spies, their betrayal encrypted in ones and zeros, in cipher text that looked like gibberish until it didn't, until it became names, places, dates, proof. But this transmission, this one was different. Elias' fingers moved across the paper as he transcribed the decoded fragment, his handwriting shaky from too much coffee and too little sleep. The eagle's shadow falls on the bear's den, poetic almost. A veiled reference to espionage that hinted at betrayal in the highest echelons, somewhere deep in the machinery of power. But whose betrayal, and at what cost? It's not just code, Elias muttered to no one, his voice swallowed by the bunker's dampness. It's a confession buried in the noise. Around him the room flickered, green screens casting eerie halos, the acrid scent of cigarette smoke curling upward like doubts that couldn't be spoken aloud. Other cryptanalysts hunched over their stations, faces gaunt and ghostly, as if they'd been down here so long they'd forgotten what sunlight felt like. Perhaps they had. The Cold War did that, turned people into shadows, into secrets, into the very thing they were fighting against. An erasure of the self in service of something larger, something that felt noble until the 3 a.m. doubts crept in, and you wondered if any of it mattered, if any secret was worth this slow disappearing. Elias rewound the tape, listened again, and there it was, a recurring motif threaded through the static like a melody you can't quite place but know you've heard before, whispers from the wire, faint, insistent, as if the past itself was leaking through the electromagnetic spectrum trying to tell him something. What do you hear in the silence between transmissions? What lives there in the gaps? He thought of his daughter, 5 years old, who believed her father worked at a post office. Safe, boring, the kind of job you could explain at dinner without lying through your teeth. She'd asked him once why his hands always smelled like metal and paper, and he'd said it was from sorting mail, and she'd believed him because children believe their fathers until they learn not to. Would she understand someday? Would any of them? The bunker's ventilation shaft groaned, and for a moment Elias could swear he heard voices in it. Russian voices, English voices, languages that predated nations and would outlive them all. The ancient human need to communicate, to reach across distance and say, I am here, I exist, remember me. Historical fact bled into present terror. The Soviets were building something, The Americans were building Omething, and everyone was building walls, physical, ideological, psychological, each brick mortared with fear and suspicion. The eagle and the bear, locked in a dance that looked like stillness from the outside but was actually a constant, exhausting tension, muscles trembling with the effort of not striking. As Elias pieced together the puzzle fragment by fragment, a pattern emerged. Not just one spy, not just one network, something bigger. The transmission mentioned coordinates, geographic, temporal, something about winter's arrival and the package beneath the snow. The quiet dread built like pressure behind a dam. Nostalgia for innocence, for a world that existed before Hiroshima, before everyone learned to fear the sky, before children practiced hiding under desks as if plywood could stop the end of the world. That innocence was gone, lost somewhere in the chill that settled over 1952 like frost on a window, making everything look beautiful and dead at the same time. Elias stepped deeper into the bunker's shadows, where the echo of Soviet secrets was beginning to form faces. Names, fears that had shapes now, substance, weight. Outside, the wind howled louder, carrying with it the scent of coming snow. And somewhere on the other side of the world, someone else sat in a similar bunker, listening to similar static, decoding similar secrets, wondering if the wire would hum forever or if one day it would finally, mercifully, go silent. But what happens when the wire does go silent? What fills that terrible, empty space? The answer Elias would learn wasn't silence at all. It was echoes. Whispers that don't fade but burrow deeper, like roots seeking water in parched soil, threading through the labyrinthine bunkers carved into Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains like veins beneath skin. The sound in his headphones may have stopped, but the resonance continued, pulling him, pulling all of them, further into the earth's cold embrace. Those mountains, God, if you could see them from above, you'd think they were innocent. Fog-shrouded peaks rising like the backbone of some ancient sleeping giant, autumn painting them in rust and gold, the kind of beauty that makes you forget the world is capable of ugliness. But look closer. Notice the barn doors that hang slightly wrong on their hinges, the paths that lead nowhere visible, the entrances masquerading as forgotten agricultural relics. Push those doors open, they creak, reluctant, protesting, and you'll find stairwells descending into darkness, into earth that hasn't seen sunlight since before any of this madness began. A low, resonant hum lived down there. Not quite mechanical, not quite alive, but something in between like a distant reactor's pulse, or the collective heartbeat of everyone who'd ever descended those stairs knowing they might not emerge the same person. Water dripped from concrete ceilings, each drop ticking like a countdown clock measuring out the seconds until... What? Discovery? Catastrophe? Nobody knew. That was the worst part. This was the architecture of paranoia made manifest. Post-World War II, when the OSS, that scrappy, improvised intelligence outfit, morphed into the CIA with all its bureaucratic legitimacy and black budgets, these bunkers became nerve centers for signals intelligence. Secret cities beneath the surface where projects like Venona operated in shadows, so deep even the shadows had clearance levels. They were cracking one-time pads, codes the Soviets believed were mathematically unbreakable, each pad used once and destroyed, theoretically perfect. Except nothing's perfect when humans are involved. The Soviets reused some pads during the chaos of war, and that tiny imperfection was enough. A crack in the armor just wide enough for people like Elias to slip through. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed erratically, their irregular rhythm somehow worse than darkness would have been. They cast long, dancing shadows across filing cabinets, metal olive green, stuffed so full of yellowed intercepts that some drawers wouldn't close anymore, papers spilling out like secrets that refused to stay buried. The air was thick, humid. It carried the musty odor of aging paper and something else, something bitter, the aftertaste of instant coffee from endless shifts, dissolved in water that tasted faintly of minerals and desperation. Elias wasn't alone down there. Lena Voss sat 3 stations away. Though away didn't mean much in a room barely large enough to hold them all without touching. Sharp-eyed, early 30s, with the kind of focus that made everyone around her feel slightly inadequate. Her glasses fogged constantly from the bunker's humid breath, and she'd wipe them clean every few minutes with a handkerchief that had seen better days. then leaned back into the Cyrillic scripts spread before her like ancient texts demanding translation. Women like Lena, linguists, mathematicians, pattern recognition savants, they were the backbone of this operation. History wouldn't remember most of their names, but men like Meredith Gardner were breaking Soviet codes while the world above debated whether women belonged in the workplace at all. The irony was rich enough to choke on. "These aren't just letters, Elias," Lena said one day, not looking up from her work. Her voice carried in the windowless room the way sound travels underwater, distorted, amplified, intimate. "Their lives encoded, pulsing like blood in a vein." He'd paused, tape recorder still spinning, and looked at her. Really looked. There were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there a month ago, age lines that didn't match her years. This place did that, aged you from the inside out, replaced your blood with caffeine and anxiety until you weren't sure what was keeping you alive anymore. The daily grind had a rhythm. Analysts huddled with ears pressed to headsets, capturing what they'd started calling whispers from the winning wire. Those triumphant moments, WH. And a decryption exposed a KGB network. When the code became a name, became an arrest, became a headline that never mentioned the people who made it possible. Small victories in a war that might never end, victories measured in lives disrupted, families destroyed, secrets pulled screaming into the light. Then the siren. Brief, just a test, they said later. But for those 7 seconds, every heart in that bunker stopped and restarted wrong. The wail cut through the hum, through the dripping water, through everything, and suddenly everyone was thinking the same thought. This is it. This is how it ends. Not with diplomacy or surrender, but with a sound, a warning that came too late because warnings always come too late. McCarthy's ghost walked those corridors even though the man himself had never descended into these particular shadows. His paranoia was ambient, airborne, infectious. Everyone suspected everyone. The Soviets had infiltrated so deep, Rosenbergs, McLean, Philby. How could you trust the person sitting next to you? How could they trust you? Elias found himself thinking about summers before the war. Stupid, really. Nostalgia for a past that probably wasn't as golden as memory painted it, but at least it was his, untainted by the wire's cold truths. Swimming holes and lightning bugs and the kind of innocence that didn't know words like mutually assured destruction were even possible. When did that end? When did the world become this? Elias. Lena's voice pulled him back. She'd gone pale, her finger trembling over a decoded sequence. "What is it?" She removed her glasses, fogged them with her breath, cleaned them slowly, buying time. When she put them back on, her eyes were different, haunted. "There's a name here," she whispered. "In the code, an asset they're running." Her voice cracked. "I know this name, I know them." The bunker seemed to contract, walls pressing closer. Because of course the wires would entangle more than secrets. Of course they'd snare souls, pull them down into this depth where truth and betrayal became indistinguishable, where every revelation came with a cost measured in relationships, in trust, in the small human connections that made life bearable. "Who?" Elias asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Lena's hand moved to her throat, fingers finding a small pendant there. Something old, immigrant silver from a family that fled Europe for safety. For America, for the promise that here at least they could belong. "My uncle," she breathed. "His name is in the code." And there it was, the moment when history stops being abstract, when the threads of the Iron Curtain unravel to reveal not ideology or geopolitics but family, blood, the terrible intimacy of betrayal. Those threads stretched from Virginia's depths all the way to Moscow's shadowed spires, where the wire's echoes reverberated like accusations in an empty hall, and Lena stood at the intersection, caught between duty and love, between what she knew and what she wished she didn't. The bunker's chill seeped deeper into their bones after that. Not just the physical cold, though that was real enough, concrete holding the Earth's winter like a grudge, but something else. The cold of understanding that the enemy wasn't always distant, wasn't always foreign. Sometimes the enemy wore a familiar face. Sometimes they sat at your family's table and carved the holiday roast and taught you words in the old language, and none of that changed what they'd done, what they were doing, what the code said they'd do next. Teletype machines clacked in relentless rhythm, spitting out perforated tape that curled like ribbon, like intestines, like the guts of truth being pulled into the light. The sound was everywhere, clack, 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 pause, clack. A Morse code dirge that never stopped because the Soviets never stopped, and neither could they, not if they wanted to stay ahead, not if they wanted to survive. Elias and Lena worked side by side now, cross-referencing cables under dim lamps that cast their faces in severe relief, all hollows and angles, looking more like the ghosts they were becoming. The room smelled of ozone and ink and something metallic that might have been fear, or might have been the accumulated sweat of everyone who'd ever descended these stairs, knowing too much and not enough simultaneously. The Venona intercepts had started in 1943, back when the Soviets were supposed to be allies, back when trust was still a commodity in circulation. But paranoia has excellent foresight. Army cryptanalysts began collecting Soviet diplomatic cables even then, storing them like seeds against a future winter, not knowing when or if they'd ever crack them. It took years. The one-time pads were supposed to be mathematically perfect. Use each code sheet once, destroy it, move on. But war is chaos, and chaos breeds mistakes, and the Soviets reused some pads during the desperate years. And that tiny human error was enough to let people like Elias and Lena slip through the cracks in perfection. What they found inside those cracks could end the world, or save it. Hard to tell the difference sometimes. "This one," Elias whispered, his voice cracking like ice on a frozen pond. His finger trembled over a decoded sequence. "It's about the bomb, our own scientists feeding the bear." The atomic secrets. That was the prize, the nightmare. The thing that kept everyone awake at 3 a.m. staring at ceilings and wondering if tomorrow would come. Klaus Fuchs, the Rosenbergs, David Greenglass, names that would later become synonymous with treason. But here in 1952, they were still just letters in a code, patterns emerging from static like constellations forming from random stars, until suddenly you saw the shape and couldn't unsee it. The Rosenbergs would die in the electric chair for what these wires whispered. June 1953, not far off now. Ethel would die still claiming innocence, and decades later historians would argue whether she knew, whether she deserved it, whether any of them deserved. The weight of carrying secrets that heavy. But here, now in the bunker's timeless present, they were just names in the code, and Lena's uncle was just another name in the code, and who got to decide which names lived and which died. Ghost. They called him that because he moved through the bunker like smoke, present but not quite substantial. Harlan Reed. 63 years old but looking 80, his hands scarred from burns he'd gotten in the Pacific, some battle whose name Elias could never remember because there were too many battles, too many scars, too much history weighing on men who'd already given everything and were being asked to give more. Harlan had been decoding Japanese transmissions during the war, back when the enemy was clear and the cause was righteous, and you could sleep at night knowing you were on the right side. Now he decoded messages about gulags and purges, about Soviet citizens disappearing into the vast frozen nothing of Siberia, about children denouncing parents and neighbors vanishing in the night, and the righteousness was harder to locate. Yes, we're better than that. But are we? Aren't we down here in our own bunkers, building our own bombs, keeping our own secrets, teaching our own children to fear? Harlan worked in silence mostly, but sometimes, late shifts when exhaustion made everyone's guard drop, he'd share things. Small things. Photographs from a wallet worn soft with handling. His daughter in a sundress, smiling at some pre-war beach. His wife before the cancer. Moments of light carried into the dark like talismans against the wire's impersonal hum. Through the static sometimes, impossibly, they'd pick up fragments of Russian folk tunes. Radio bleed or imagination or maybe just the universe's cruel sense of irony, these beautiful melodies drifting through the electromagnetic spectrum, reminding them that the people on the other end of the wire were human too, had music and stories and loves and losses just like anyone else. The beauty made it worse somehow. Would have been easier if the enemy were monstrous, if the codes revealed only evil. But they revealed people, flawed, frightened, doing what they thought they had to do to survive just like everyone else. The whispers from the winning wire preserved a fragile peace. That was the story they told themselves. Each broken code was a step away from war, a revelation that prevented surprise, a thread that kept the tapestry from unraveling completely. But look closer. Those same whispers sowed seeds of mutual destruction, fed the paranoia, justified the escalation. Every secret revealed led to another bomb built, another bunker dug, another layer of separation between the truth and what people were allowed to know. Nostalgia crept in during the quiet moments. Elias would think about his daughter's laugh. Lena would finger that immigrant pendant and remember dinners before the war, before the codes, before everything got so complicated. Harlan would stare at his photographs and wonder if any of them would recognize him now, if he'd sacrificed so much of himself that nothing remained worth coming home to. Then the work would resume, always the work. It was Harlan who found it 3 days after Lena's revelation. His hands, those scarred, trembling hands, went still over a fresh intercept. His face went gray. "Living," he said, just that one word. "What?" Elias crossed the room. Harlan looked up and his eyes were holes. "The traitor they're running, this one, they're still active, still feeding them information." He swallowed hard. "And I know where they are." Betrayals echo, don't they? Like whispers that refuse to die, reverberating through the lives of those who listened until you can't tell anymore where the code ends and your own thoughts begin. Harlan's words hung in the recycled air of the bunker, and suddenly every face became a possibility, every colleague a potential enemy, every shared secret a weapon waiting to be turned. The living breathed differently than the dead. The dead, the Rosenbergs, Klaus Futch with his soft British accent and softer betrayals, all those names archived in files that smelled of mothballs and regret. They were history now, abstractions you could study without feeling the weight of their humanity pressing against your chest. But the living walked these same corridors, drank from the same coffee pot, breathed the same stale air. The living could look you in the eye. Steam rose from tin mugs of tea in the break room, mingling with the metallic bite of solder where someone was repairing a radio in the corner. How many times had that radio been fixed? How many times had they all been broken and repaired, until the original parts were unrecognizable? Elias watched the steam curl upward, dissipating into nothing, and wondered if that's what happened to people down here. A slow evaporation of the self. He hadn't slept in, 3 days? 4. Time moved strangely in the bunker's perpetual fluorescent twilight. When he closed his eyes, he heard voices in the static. Not real voices, or maybe more real than real, the accumulated weight of every intercepted transmission he'd ever decoded, every secret that had passed through his hands and into his head and lodged there like shrapnel. Sometimes he'd jolt awake, had he been asleep. Sitting at his desk with his eyes closed wasn't the same as sleep, was it? Convinced, he could hear Russian voices speaking his daughter's name. His wife had stopped asking questions. That was worse than the fighting. At least fighting meant engagement, meant she still cared enough to be angry. Now she just looked at him with this careful blankness when he came home, as if that word still meant what it used to, and he knew she was seeing through him, seeing the absence where a husband should be. The work is important, he'd tried to explain once, back when explanation still seemed possible. The work, she'd repeated, and the way she said it made it sound like a disease. The shadows in the bunker flickered. Trick of the lights or trick of the mind, down here the distinction didn't matter much. Sometimes Elias thought he could see them pacing the corridors, all the ghosts of people who'd given too much to the wire. Not actual ghosts, or maybe actual ghosts. What's the difference between a haunting and a memory that won't let go? Lena decoded a message about her father 2 weeks after the uncle revelation. Her hands didn't shake. That was the remarkable thing. She just sat there, reading the Cyrillic letters that spelled out her father's defection. A man who'd supposedly died in a factory accident in 1947, now revealed as having fled to East Germany, now probably dead for real in some unmarked grave behind the Iron Curtain, now forever a traitor in the files if not in her heart. "We're not just breaking codes," she whispered to Elias during a shift change, her voice so quiet he almost missed it under the teletype's clatter. "We're breaking ourselves piece by piece." And what could he say to that? Nothing that would help, nothing that would change anything. The mess hall became something like a confessional in the late hours, when exhaustion stripped away the professional veneer and left just people, damaged and damaging, holding tin mugs and sharing tales that felt both urgent and pointless. Harlan sat at the corner table one night, and his voice, gravelly, worn smooth by too many cigarettes and secrets, drifted through the room like smoke. "Decoded a message once," he said to no one and everyone. Pacific Theater 44, it was Japanese, but the sender, I recognized the cadence. The pattern, you do this long enough, you start to see personality in the code, like handwriting. He paused, sipped something that wasn't coffee. Turned out to be someone I knew, someone I'd, another pause. Well, you learn to separate the work from the person, or you try to, doesn't always take. Someone laughed hollow, someone else didn't. From somewhere, maybe Harlan's pocket, maybe the room itself, maybe the past bleeding through, came the soft, eerie strain of violin music. A folk tune, melody twisted by distance or memory or both, mimicking the wire's melancholic song. It evoked something. What? Nostalgia for a world without such vigilance, dread at what vigilance had cost, wonder that humans could create such beauty and such ugliness simultaneously, sometimes in the same breath. Klaus Futsch. That name kept appearing in the declassified Venona files, kept haunting the margins of conversation. British physicist, German refugee, communist sympathizer, atomic spy. He'd handed Stalin the secrets to the bomb, accelerated the arms race by years, changed the geometry of power forever. And why? Ideology, conscience. The conviction that no single nation should hold such terrible knowledge alone, maybe all of those, maybe none. Maybe he just wanted to matter, to be remembered, to leave a mark deeper than the shallow grave we all eventually occupy. Did it matter why? The bombs existed now regardless of motivation. Elias dropped a pencil once. Stupid thing, meaningless, but he watched it roll across the concrete floor into the darkness under a filing cabinet and felt something crack inside him. That pencil was innocence. That pencil was the person he'd been before the wire. That pencil was every small thing sacrificed to the greater cause until you looked around and realized the small things were actually everything that mattered. They found Coleman in the bathroom. James Coleman, cryptanalyst, 38 years old, husband, father of 2, excellent at crosswords, couldn't handle the pressure. The official report said heart attack. Everyone knew better. You don't shoot yourself in the heart by accident. Elias had worked next to him for 6 months. Had shared coffee. Had discussed nothing more significant than baseball scores because that was the unspoken agreement. You kept the work and the life separate, you didn't blur the lines, you didn't burden each other with the weight you were already carrying alone. At Coleman's desk, they found a note. Not a suicide note, just a scrap of paper with a decoded fragment. How long can a man serve 2 masters before he ceases to exist? No one claimed the note. It went into a file. Everything went into files. The wind howled through the ventilation shafts that night, carrying with it the ghost whisper of forgotten names, the accumulated weight of every person who'd ever been betrayed or become a betrayer, every secret that had been worth dying for and wasn't, every lie that had been necessary until it became the truth. Lena handed Elias a fresh intercept just before dawn. Her face was gray. "This one's still encrypted," she said, "but the signature, it's from the active asset, they're planning something." Her finger traced the header codes. Soon. Names, once mere ciphers humming through the wire, now emerged like specters from fog, their forgotten whispers coalescing into revelations that chilled even the bunker's already frozen air. The wind's howl through the ventilation shafts morphed into something else that night, something that sounded less like weather and more like a distorted broadcast, as if the iron curtain itself had learned to breathe and was now exhaling directly down their necks. Soon, what a word, what a threat dressed up as a promise. The acrid tang of overheated wiring filled the room, transformers pushed beyond their limits, circuits carrying more current than they were designed for, everything running hot and desperate. It mixed with the earthy damp of leaking ceilings, water finding its way through concrete the way truth finds its way through lies, eventually. Droplets plinked onto metal surfaces with irregular rhythm, like code keys B. Ing tapped by invisible hands, plink, pause, plink, plink, pause, as if the bunker itself was trying to tell them something. Green visors reflected frantic eyes scanning endless printouts, paper spilling from teletype machines faster than they could read it, faster than they could process, the Soviets suddenly chattering with unusual frequency. Or maybe not unusual. Maybe this was always the volume, and they just never had enough people listening, enough people willing to descend into the earth and surrender their surface lives to decode the darkness. Elias and Lena stood before a wall they'd constructed from declassified cables. Dozens, hundreds eventually, pinned and connected with red thread like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. except this conspiracy was real and documented and had already killed people. The 1950s Venona breakthroughs had fingered names that became household. Alger Hiss, the State Department golden boy turned Soviet asset, his perjury trial splitting the nation between those who believed in American innocence and those who'd learned that innocence was just another word for willful blindness. Harry Dexter White, Judith Kaplan, each name a thread in a tapestry of betrayal that stretched from Washington to Moscow and back again. The Red Scare wasn't hysteria if the threats were real, but it was still hysteria. Both things could be true. That was the cruel genius of it. McCarthy could be a demagogue and a drunk and still be partially right, and the people he destroyed could be both innocent and guilty depending on which lens you looked through, which decade you asked. A flickering bulb cast jagged shadows across the cable wall, making the threads seem to move, to breathe, to reach out like the fingers of something buried trying to claw its way back to the surface. How many networks? How many moles? How deep did it go? These whispers, Harlan growled from behind them, his voice cutting through the teletype clatter. He'd been standing there so quietly they'd forgotten he was present, or maybe he'd just materialized the way ghosts do, called into being by the accumulated weight of secrets. They're not from the dead, they're from the living, plotting in plain sight. And wasn't that the terrifying part? The dead you could mourn or condemn or file away. The living kept acting, kept choosing, kept betraying or being betrayed in real time while you scrambled to catch up. Lena's mind kept returning to a name she'd read in a footnote months ago, Elizabeth Bentley. The Red Spy Queen, they'd called her in the papers, though that sensationalized what was really just a sad story of idealism curdled into pragmatism, then fear, then desperate self-preservation. A former Soviet courier who turned herself in, testified before Congress, named names until her former comrades called her Judas and her new allies called her traitor to the cause. And she ended up belonging nowhere, trusted by no one, living out her days in obscurity wondering if confession had been salvation or just a different kind of damnation. Were they the same? Lena and this ghost of a whistleblower, both women trying to navigate impossible loyalties, both decoding not just messages but the meaning of betrayal itself. Ally or adversary, family or country, love or duty, as if those were binary choices, as if life worked in ones and zeros instead of the messy, overlapping gray that actually characterized human experience. The ambient reactor hum that was always present, so constant you usually stopped hearing it, like living next to train tracks, suddenly swelled to a dissonant whine. Transformers overloading, wiring failing, or just the accumulated electrical signature of too many machines running too hard for too long, the infrastructure straining under the weight of so much desperate listening. Phantom radio static cut through the whine, whispers in Cyrillic that made no sense but felt meaningful, like hearing someone pray in a language you don't speak, but understanding the emotion anyway. Elias recalled boyhood radio adventures, staying up late with a shortwave set his uncle had given him, spinning the dial to catch distant stations, Brazilian music and BBC News, and once, impossibly, what he thought was Australian football. The wonder of voices traveling through the ether, the magic of connection across vast distance. When had that wonder twisted into this? This nocturnal vigil, this hunting of human prey through electromagnetic spectrum, this reduction of human complexity to signal and noise. Ah, but isn't it wondrous still in its way? These codes revealing not just secrets but the fragility of trust itself, like a wire fraying under tension, until you can watch the individual strands snap one by one and know with absolute certainty. That collapse is coming but can't stop pulling anyway. Lena's hands moved across the cables, tracing connections, her fingers following red thread like Ariadne in the labyrinth, except there was no Theseus coming to save her, just more maze, always more maze. She found the pattern. Jesus, she found the pattern. Elias. Something in her voice made everyone stop. The teletype machines kept clattering, but the humans went still, that collective held breath of people who know they're about to learn something they can't unlearn. The current infiltration, the active asset. Her finger rested on a decoded fragment dated 3 days ago. They're targeting something specific, something, she swallowed, traced another line, something related to Arlington Hall personnel files. Why would they? Elias started. Because they're looking for leverage, vulnerabilities, personal information that could be exploited. Her hand shook now. She pulled another cable down, held it next to the first. The connections formed. There's a footnote here, a cross-reference to family backgrounds of key analysts. Harlan leaned in, his scarred hands steady where hers weren't. He read the Cyrillic notation, translated it in his head. His face went gray. "Lena," he said quietly, "your name is here. Not as an analyst, not as an employee, but as a target, as leverage, as a vulnerability to be exploited because of what her family had been, what her uncle had done, what her father had become. The sins of relation visited upon the daughter, because in this world, in this cold, watchful world where everyone suspected everyone, blood was evidence and family was liability and love was just another weapon to be turned against you." The bunker's hum pulsed like a heart on the brink. The team moved into motion, cross-referencing, verifying, racing against time that had already passed because the message was 3 days old, and 3 days was an eternity in intelligence work. 3 days was enough time for entire operations to execute and disappear. Outside, if outside still existed, if the surface world hadn't become as mythical as Atlantis, dawn was breaking. They couldn't see it, of course. They never saw it. But somewhere above their heads, light was touching the Virginia hills, burning off the fog, revealing the true shape of things that darkness had obscured. Down here, revelation felt like drowning. But drowning men don't surrender. They thrash, they fight. They pull air from water through sheer desperate refusal to accept the inevitable. And so the bunker erupted into motion, not the slow, methodical work of routine decryption, but something feral, urgent, hearts hammering against ribs like prisoners against cell bars. The echoes no longer whispered. They wailed. The hum intensified until it wasn't background anymore but foreground, a living presence that seemed to coil through the ventilation shafts like something with intention, with hunger. Footsteps echoed down corridors, running now, not walking, as personnel converged on the cryptanalysis center. The wire itself felt alive, taut as a piano string waiting to snap, and everyone could feel the tension building toward some terrible crescendo. Sweat beaded on foreheads under harsh lights that suddenly seemed too bright, exposing too much, leaving nowhere to hide from what they were about to uncover. The air thickened with ozone from sparking consoles, equipment pushed beyond safe limits, circuits overloading, everything running hot because there was no time for caution, no time for protocol. Fear had a taste. Metallic, sour, like blood or old pennies or the breath of someone who hasn't slept in days. Papers scattered like autumn leaves caught in a draft when someone slammed through a door too fast. Intelligence reports swirling and settling in new patterns, as if even the documents themselves were reorganizing around the emerging truth. This felt like 1962 all over again. That October when the world held its breath for 13 days while Kennedy and Khrushchev played chess with nuclear warheads, while U-2 pilots photographed missiles in Cuban fields, while the ghosts of Venona whispered their warnings from beyond their official closure. The project had supposedly ended in 1980, but its legacy, its methods, its paranoia, its cost, informed every decision, every brinkmanship, every moment when human civilization teetered on the edge of self-annihilation and chose, barely, to step back. The scars of that perpetual vigilance never healed. They couldn't, not when the price of letting your guard down was measured in megatons. "All hands," Elias called out, his voice cracking. "Everything we've got. Cross-reference every intercept from the past month against the personnel file access pattern." They huddled, a dozen analysts crowding around a single table, shoulders touching, breath mingling, becoming something collective and desperate. The teletype machines chattered their endless sermon. Someone's radio picked up a false alarm siren from a drill somewhere above, its wail bleeding through concrete and earth to reach them here in their tomb. And for 5 eternal seconds everyone froze, wondering if this was it, if the warnings had come too late, if the whispers had tried to tell them something they'd failed to hear. But no, just a drill, just practice for an apocalypse that was always tomorrow, never today. Elias' fingers flew across decoded fragments, pulling threads, connecting patterns that had been invisible until they weren't. The final piece clicked into place at 4:47 a.m. He'd remember that forever, the exact moment the truth crystallized, and it was worse than they'd feared. Not just espionage, sabotage. A Soviet plot to compromise U.S. defense communications, to plant backdoors in the very systems they were using to listen, to turn their vigilance into vulnerability. How long had it been operational? How much had already been compromised? Jesus Christ, someone whispered, reading over his shoulder. We've won the wire, Lena said, her voice breaking like glass under pressure, but at what cost? These secrets devour us. And she was right. Look at them, gray-faced, hollow-eyed, marriages failing, children growing up without parents who were technically present but fundamentally absent, souls slowly eroding like coastline under relentless waves. They'd broken the codes, yes, exposed the spies, prevented attacks, preserved a peace that wasn't peace but at least wasn't war. But what had they sacrificed? What pieces of themselves had they encrypted into the wire and never gotten back? Harlan stood suddenly, his chair scraping concrete with a sound like a scream. His scarred hands, those Pacific burns that never quite healed, tissue that remembered fire, grabbed his headset and smashed it against the console. Once. Twice. The equipment shattered, plastic and wire, and the remnants of 1,000 intercepted conversations exploding into fragments. Enough, his voice was raw. Enough, we break their codes, they be. Wreak ours, we plant spies, they plant spies. We build bombs, they build bombs. When does it end? When do we stop listening to the wire long enough to remember we're human? No one answered. How could they? The question was too big, too terrible, too close to the doubts they all carried but never voiced because voicing them felt like betrayal of something they couldn't name but had sworn to protect. The orchestration of sound built around them. Distant sirens howling like wind through a dying world, mixing with distorted voices from surveillance tapes played too fast. Fragments of Russian and English and languages that predated nations, all of it bleeding together into something that evoked both wonder and terror. Wonder at human ingenuity, at the staggering complexity of this machinery they'd built to spy and counterspy and spy on the spies. Terror at what it had cost, what it would continue to cost, what it meant that they couldn't stop even if they wanted to. Someone stammered a confession about missing their daughter's birthday. Someone else's face was tear-streaked, though they tried to hide it. These imperfections, these cracks in the professional veneer, they were what made it real, what made it bearable, what proved they hadn't become the machines they operated. Elias thought about all the unsung guardians who'd walked these halls, sat at these stations, given their best years to decoding whispers in the dark. Codebreakers whose names would never appear in history books, whose contributions would remain classified until everyone who remembered them was dead, whose nostalgia for simpler times, for a world before Hiroshima, before ICBMs, before mutually assured destruction became doctrine, clashed constantly with the dread that any moment could be the moment they failed to decrypt the warning in time. A simulation alarm blared, another drill, or maybe an actual alert who could tell anymore, and the team snapped back into motion. They had the pattern now. They knew the threat. But knowing and stopping weren't the same thing, and the protocols for what came next were complicated by the fact that Lena's family was entangled in this, that personal and professional had collapsed into each other like stars going supernova. Choices, everything came down to choices. Report everything and watch her world implode, hold back intelligence and risk national security. There were no good options. There never were. Just degrees of damage, shades of betrayal, the eternal calculus of the lesser evil. The climax came not with violence but with silence. A moment when all the machines stopped at once, a power fluctuation or divine intervention or just coincidence. And in that sudden absence of sound, the whispers that had sustained them, terrified them, defined them for so long fractured into nothing. The bunker's hum faded like a dying echo, and for 3 heartbeats they existed in a world without the wire. Then the backup generators kicked in, the machines resumed their endless vigilance, the moment passed. But something had changed. Something had broken that wouldn't be repaired. They emerged from the station battered, diminished, carrying with them the weight of prevented disasters that no one would ever know about, that history wouldn't record, that mattered absolutely and not at all. The wire had been victorious, yes, but victory felt like ashes, tasted like loss. left only spectral traces where living people used to be. Traces faint as dying embers. That's all that remained when the hum finally diminished to a whisper, when the machines cycled down for maintenance or mercy, hard to tell which, and the bunker doors opened for the first time in what felt like years but was probably just days. Time moved strangely down there, always had. Dawn broke over the Virginia hills the way it always did, indifferent to human drama, caring nothing for secrets or sacrifices or the small wars fought in concrete tombs beneath its rising light. The wind sighed through those open bunker doors like something exhaling after holding its breath too long, carrying with it the crisp bite of morning air that cut through lingering cigarette smoke and ozone and fear sweat. The contrast was almost violent. The clean, the corrupt, two worlds touching at a threshold neither could fully cross. Dew kissed the autumn leaves made them glisten like they'd been crying. They rustled with the softness of turned pages, of stories ending whether anyone was ready for the ending or not. Inside, a final tape reeled to a stop, its click echoing through empty corridors like a period at story's end. Not an exclamation point, not a question mark, just a period, full stop, that's all. Except nothing ever really stops, does it? Venona would remain classified for decades. The files would sit in archives yellowing while the world moved on through Vietnam, through détente, through Reagan's tear down this wall, through the Soviet Union's collapse that felt both inevitable and impossible. It wasn't until 1995 that they'd declassify it all, release the proof of what these codebreakers had done, give names to the ghosts who'd walked these halls. By then, most of them would be old or dead, or simply tired of carrying secrets that had lost their urgency, but never their weight. The work shaped the Cold War's end, though you couldn't draw a straight line from decoded cable to fallen empire. History doesn't work that way, but the information fed the policies, informed the strategies, gave American leaders the confidence to push when pushing mattered. And yet, the legacy they left wasn't just victory. It was a template for surveillance that would outlive the Soviet Union, would evolve and metastasize into something they couldn't have imagined. Digital whispers replacing wire whispers, algorithms doing what cryptanalysts once did, the entire world becoming one vast intercept waiting to be decoded. Elias, Lena, and Harlan stood atop a hill overlooking the hidden facility. From up here you couldn't tell what lay beneath. Just a barn, just trees, just Earth holding its secrets close. Faded intercepts fluttered in the breeze. Someone had brought them up, maybe as ritual, maybe as exorcism. Russian words and English words mixing in the wind. Becoming meaningless, becoming everything. They stood in silence for a long time. What was there to say that the work hadn't already said? What comfort could words provide that would matter more than the shared understanding of people who descended together into darkness and emerged? Not broken, exactly. Changed. Alchemized by pressure and fear and the strange intimacy of shared secrets. Finally, Elias murmured, his voice barely audible over the wind. The whispers won us the war, but they stole our peace. Echoes will carry forever. Lena touched her pendant, that piece of immigrant silver that connected her to a past that had become unbearably complicated. Her uncle had been arrested, her father's defection confirmed, her own name cleared but marked forever in files that would outlive her. "Do we get to have both?" she asked. "Victory and peace." No one answered. The question was rhetorical anyway, they already knew. Harlan's scarred hands hung loose at his sides, empty of headphones, empty of decoded secrets, just hands again for the first time in decades. He'd find solace eventually, somewhere in anonymity in a small town where no one knew what he'd done or who he'd been. He'd grow a garden, take up woodworking, die quietly in his sleep at 78, and the obituary would say he'd been a government clerk, which was true in the way that half-truths are the most effective lies. Lena would reunite with family, the ones who weren't compromised, the ones who'd fled Europe for safety and found instead a different kind of danger. She'd teach Russian literature at a small college, translate Akhmatova and Tsveteva, poets who understood about secrets and silence. Students would find her enigmatic. She'd never tell them why. Elias would try to go home to be a husband and father again, but the space he'd occupied had closed around his absence like water around a stone removed from a pond. His wife would ask for divorce in 1954. Kind about it, but firm. "You left before you left," she'd say, and he couldn't argue because it was true. He'd live alone after that, work civilian cryptography jobs, die in 1987 clutching a photograph of his daughter who'd learned to love him from a distance but never quite trust him to stay. These were the tapestries of human endurance, woven from threads of duty and loss, sacrifice and survival. Not heroic exactly, just human, deeply, imperfectly, achingly human. The melancholic strings of memory fade into natural winds, and what are we left with? Nostalgia for an era of shadowed heroism, yes, but also dread, that particular Cold War dread of endless echoes, of whispers that never quite stop even when the wire goes silent. Because here's the thing about secrets: once they exist, they persist. They find new channels, new frequencies, new wires to travel through. Oh, the subtle imperfection of memory, how it bends truths like wires under strain. Was it really like this? Were they really so dedicated, so damaged, so heroic and broken simultaneously? Or does distance make myths of mere men, turns bureaucracy into epic, transforms the mundane grinding work of decryption into something that gleams with meaning it maybe never had? Both, again always both. The Codebreakers descended those stairs knowing they might not emerge the same. They didn't. None of them did. But they'd kept the whispers from becoming screams, the Cold War from becoming hot, the ending of the world from arriving ahead of schedule, small victories, enormous costs, the math never quite balanced. And now, standing in our own digital age where the wire has become invisible, where surveillance is ambient and constant and mostly consensual because we've learned to love our chains, we might ask, did they win? Really? Or did they just postpone, delay, push the inevitable reckoning downstream to us, to now, to the future they saved but couldn't control? Empires rise and fall. Borders shift. Ideologies clash and merge and mutate into things their originators wouldn't recognize. But the wire's secrets endure, faint and eternal, humming beneath the surface of our connected world like the ghost of that bunker's reactor, like the accumulated whispers of everyone who ever sent a message they thought was private, ever trusted encryption to keep them safe, ever believed the watchers wouldn't watch them. There was a sound in the dead of night that could end the world. Soft, persistent, a wire humming, and if you listen, really listen past the noise of our modern age, you can still hear it, waiting, whispering, wondering who's listening back.